we have heard as well about this region called the Mayasa region, which is Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, and about the various opportunities within that, particularly with regards to private markets and sustainability. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be doing a much deeper dive into Africa. Obviously, it's a very broad, diverse continent in and of itself, but I'm very excited that we have an expert, David Pilling, who's the Africa editor from the Financial Times, and Gosego January, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Debswana Pension Fund in Africa. So I'd like to welcome our next panelists to the stage. Please give them a big round of applause.
Thanks very much. My name's David Pilling. I'm the Africa editor of the Financial Times, as you've just heard. I'm delighted to be here with Gosego January, the CEO of Debswana Pension Fund, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about later. But the subject of the panel is investment opportunities on the mother continent, of course, being Africa. And not that long ago, after the global financial crisis, Africa was sort of in the news, this narrative about Africa rising. There was a lot of excitement. It was the next frontier. The demographics of Africa, are challenging, but also very interesting. Now there's about 1.2 billion people. The population is liable to double by 2050, could double again to 4 billion by the end of the century. Now, while that could presage problems, it can also be a portent of, rising middle class, consumption class, etc. Anyway, so this narrative of Africa rising really sort of took off. Then the oil price shock came in 2014, and the kind of narrative went off the boil a bit. Some of the big economies, Nigeria and Angola, oil producers, and indeed South Africa, for other reasons, really sort of stopped growing, and therefore the continent as a whole, didn't look so good. Yet within that, as you know, there are many, many countries that are still growing very fast. I think last year, and indeed this year, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent. This year, I think, if I remember right, that's countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Djibouti, and one other that I'm forgetting, Tanzania maybe actually. So there are these very fast-growing economies in a continent that as a whole doesn't look so pretty. So that's a very long-winded opening. Where are we with the Africa rising narrative? Is Africa really a big investment opportunity, or is it somewhere that that's not ready yet for investors?
Perhaps let me begin by introducing myself, David. My name is Gosego January, and I'm an asset owner in the sense that I'm a CEO of a pension fund in Botswana. Your question is very relevant at this particular time because I believe, and we believe, that Africa is still rising. There are plenty of opportunities in every single country in Africa, and basically the most important area is around infrastructure and infrastructure development. If you look at the shortfall in terms of the power that the countries all have, if you look at the shortfall in terms of rail, in terms of roads, there are plenty of opportunities there. A lot of investors look at Africa and say, will I make my money there? We believe that we can make your money there, and as the Debswana Pension Fund, we are invested in the Africa continent, and we are starting to see the returns trickling in. There is political instabilities in some of the countries in Africa, but so is the rest of the world, if I may say. You've got the Brexit in Britain, you've got Trump in the US, and we also have our political issues. But having these political issues does not take away the fact that you can still invest in Africa and still make a lot of money. I think those people, you're asking me, is this the right time? I think it is the right time because those that come in early are likely to be those that are going to benefit much more than those that are going to play the wait-and-see game. If you look at the whole continent, and you've mentioned that before, that there are a number of countries that are growing significantly. Even those that are not growing at the particular rate are at least growing at about 3%. And that is good growth in this particular era.
Yeah, well, obviously you have population growth. So, I mean, even if you've got per capita rates that are not growing, just by dint of the population rising, you tend to get some growth.
And the middle class is growing at a good rate at this particular time. We do still have resources that are doing quite well, like the diamonds in Botswana, as an example.
I'm going to ask you about Botswana in a second. Let me just stick at the kind of 10,000 feet level. You mentioned that it's possible to make money in Africa, and indeed, I come across investors quite regularly who talk about, pretty decent returns, and actually much less risk than is sometimes imagined. The default rate is relatively low on some of these big projects, often because they have big multilateral lenders, like the IFC or the World Bank or Britain's CDC, kind of there almost sort of acting as a guarantor. One of the problems, though, is getting money out. Big forex problems, accessing dollars in Ethiopia, for example, which is an economy that's been growing at 10%. But you can get your money in, but maybe it's not so easy to get your money out. Nigeria, as well, has always been a problem to get hold of foreign exchange. Specifically on the foreign exchange issue and more broadly on the regulatory issue, how do you see the landscape?
From a monetary policy perspective, some of the countries are a bit difficult, as you mentioned, Nigeria. But one of the things that we find from an investment perspective is that some people invest in companies that have parent companies elsewhere in the world, and therefore getting the money out does not necessarily become a big problem. So there are ways in which you can still invest in areas where, from a regulatory perspective, it is difficult to get your money out, but there are certain ways that you could still get your money out. And I think with the reforms that we're starting to see in a lot of the African countries, they are reviewing their monetary regulations. They are looking at them because there is a huge need for forex to come into the countries.
Now, I know that Debswana, which we will talk about in 1 second, but I know that it's mainly an equity investor. But I did just want to mention the whole Eurobond market, because there has been this explosion of Eurobond debt. I was just looking up some numbers. There are now 21 countries have issued Eurobonds, sovereign bonds, but in the sort of private debt markets, foreign debt markets. More than 100 billion in debt. But there's some concern that countries are getting a bit addicted to this, that we could be heading for another debt crisis. People mention Zambia, say, as a country that may have borrowed too much. Is there that feeling that maybe countries are borrowing a bit too much?
As an investor, and an investor in both Africa and the rest of the world, yes, there is that concern, especially at a time when interest rates are very, very low. And we are seeing this right across the world, right across the globe, where we are starting to see interest rates fall significantly. I can recall, again, I'll give Botswana as an example, that about 10 years ago, we were sitting at 17% interest rates. We are at our all-time low now at 4.75. So with that, we do see the debt rising. And
Because it's tempting to borrow,
because
basically.
it's tempting to borrow. And that might actually be the next crisis that comes along, and the next recession over the next year or two
Right.
that comes along is probably going to be an interest rate recession.
Let's talk about Botswana specifically. Funnily enough, it's a country I don't know that well. I go all over the continent, but Botswana is a country I don't know particularly well. First of all, let's start with Debswana. So you are a joint venture between De Beers and Anglo American. You manage the pension fund of people who work for those companies. Is that right? Is that right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about the performance, where you invest. Just give us a little bit of an overview.
We invest, regulation allows us to invest up to 70% offshore.
Okay.
And that is basically because Botswana is such a small country
Yes.
with a population of about 2 million plus.
So you wouldn't have the liquidity to
So you
invest.
wouldn't
Yeah.
really have that much liquidity. And where we have invested is in the US, emerging markets. We've got a manager in London who manages our fixed income portfolio, and we have managers that manage our Africa portfolio. We've also invested in private equity fund, which is really running a mezzanine fund in the African continent. So that is how much we have conviction around the African continent and believe that it is the place to be. In one of our investments, we are starting to realize returns of IRRs of 25% and 2 times money, 3 times money in those particular investments.
What are the returns of the overall fund? What's the record been?
Oh, the fund, as of this year, we are doing quite well. We are sitting at 13%. Real returns, so that is quite good. And then again, the inflation in the country has been quite at its all-time low at about 2.9%.
Right, so about 30% of your investments, if I understood right, are actually in Botswana itself.
Yes.
Botswana has this reputation of being a country that's managed its resources very well. It's obviously diamond rich, I think the second biggest diamond producer in the world, but it hasn't sort of fallen prey, at least not as much as some other countries in Africa and elsewhere, to the sort of resource curse. It's managed that quite well. It's trying to do as much value added as possible in Botswana. But there have been some, I think that during the recent election, one of the opposition candidates was saying that Botswana should do more, that it should push for more value added within the country, in the diamond industry. Is this now becoming a topic of conversation?
It has been a topic of conversation for quite a while in terms of Botswana looking at the whole value chain and seeing how to invest in the whole value chain. If you can recall, about a couple of years back, we actually moved the aggregation from the London office to Botswana. So we are currently seeing aggregation being done in Botswana and a whole organization being set up. That was the first step into us trying to say, look, we are the second largest producers of diamonds in the world. Let us now become a hub. We still believe that we can do that. However, diversification is one of the things that we're also looking at because, as you know, diamonds are not infinite. And at one point...
I thought diamonds were forever.
They are forever on your hand. As a jewelry piece.
Yeah.
But in terms of mining them, there is going to come a time when we will not have diamonds, and therefore
Yes.
we need to diversify the economy. And as with all of Africa, Africa is also looking at diversifying the economy away from the minerals that we have, and hence the reason why, as an investment case, it is the right time to invest in all the other diverse areas that we are not already there.
But if I could push you a bit on that, I mean, it's not easy to do, is it? I mean, I was just in Ghana where, the president has said, we produce, I think it is 1/5 of all the cocoa beans in the world in a chocolate industry that is $107 billion chocolate industry. Ghana's share of that is $2 billion. Tiny, given that the chocolate industry couldn't really exist without Ghana and Ivory Coast next door. And yet moving up the value chain, eventually, making chocolate in Ghana, let's say, is actually very, very difficult. If you take Nigeria, which has become totally dependent on oil 90% of its forex revenues come from oil, maybe even more than that, actually. It's become an economy that gets oil revenue and then distributes it around the political system. It's not easy to diversify.
It's not easy, but having been in Abu Dhabi for the last 2 days, I've looked at what they have done with the country, and I believe that it can be done. It's not something that is impossible. It is something that needs conviction, and it is something that needs the right leadership in order to bring it there. You see, a lot of African countries are not poor countries. It is the right mindset and the right leadership that will get the investors to come in and invest in those particular areas. And I do hope that from this particular conference, those that are listening, they start looking at Africa as the next place.
And interestingly, I mean, we think of Africa as a resource-rich continent, but funnily enough, it's some of the countries that don't have that many resources that are doing well. Ethiopia being an example, is not really a resource-rich country, and yet it's been growing at more or less 10% a year for 15 years. Abiy Ahmed obviously just won the Nobel Prize. Rwanda, though a much smaller economy, I think with only 12 million people, Ethiopia is more like 110 million people. But Rwanda, as an economic model, is also doing well at becoming a convention center. It's got its airline, tourist center, producing coffee. So it's some of these economies that don't have tons of minerals, aren't blessed with diamonds and gold and copper, that actually seem to be doing better.
And that's where you talk about the resource curse.
Yes.
Because once you have the resources, it is easier to look at them and make them the prime economy drivers. But when you don't have those resources, then the leadership need to think a little bit differently and out of the box to grow those economies. And hence the reason why we still believe in Africa, that Africa is still the place to be at this particular time, because there are huge opportunities for growth. There are huge opportunities to diversify the individual economies. And as you talked about Debswana, it proves that a joint venture model does work, because Debswana has partnered with, De Beers has partnered with the government of Botswana for the past many years, and that relationship has really grown.
It's endured.
And yes.
I mean, you talk about diversification of Africa. Interestingly, we've seen an important diversification of foreign direct investment into Africa. Since China really kind of ratcheted up its investments in African trade around 2000. You've seen India, you've seen Turkey, you've seen the Gulf states. Abu Dhabi itself has been very interested in investing in the Horn. We saw a $3 billion loan to Ethiopia coming from Abu Dhabi, for example. And then, VC funds from Asia, from the west coast of America. The sort of investment universe seems to be becoming richer and more diverse. Do you see that, I mean, from where you are?
Yes, definitely. We are starting to see quite a lot of that. We are starting to see a lot of countries in Africa turning themselves into financial hubs. If you look at Mauritius, Mauritius is now one of those countries that have transitioned quite well and have become a financial hub. So from an Africa's perspective, you need to look at, we are starting to look at the financial industry, we are starting to look at the health industry, we are starting to look at education as some of those things that we can diversify into.
Right. I kind of need to wrap it up now. A couple of other things I suppose to mention. One is the African free trade area, the continental free trade area. So while we have very segmented markets at the moment, there is at least the possibility now of these markets becoming more integrated and investments going into Africa, kind of gaining the scale from being in the continent as a whole. And as you say, infrastructure is obviously the huge deficit, and in the final word, you have been able to make money out of infrastructure investments, is that right?
Definitely.
You have?
We have been able to do that. If you look at right now, there's a bridge that is being built between Botswana and Zambia and Zimbabwe, and that bridge is going to assist in terms of trade.
Okay.
We've run
We'll
out.
leave it there. We have run out of time. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.